Existence naturally precedes any idealization of it which men can contrive, since they, at least, must exit first. Yet in the order of values, knowledge of existence is subsidiary to knowledge of ideals. If it be true that a good physics is as yet the predominant need in science, and that man is still most troubled by his ignorance of matters of fact, this circumstance marks his illiberal condition. Without knowledge of existence, nothing can be done, but nothing is really done until something else is known also, the use or excellence that existence may have. It is a great pity that those finer temperaments that are naturally addressed to the ideal should have turned their energies to produce bad physics, or to preventing others from establishing natural truths. For if physics were established on a firm basis, the idealists would, for the first time, have a free field. They might then recover their proper function of expressing the mind honestly, and disdain the sorry attempt to prolong confusion and to fish in troubled waters. Perhaps, if physical truth had not been so hugely misrepresented in men's faith and conduct, it would not need to be minutely revealed or particularly emphasized. When the conditions surrounding life are not rightly faced by instinct, they are inevitably forced upon reflection through painful shocks. And for a long time the new habit thus forced upon men brings to consciousness not so much the movement of consciousness itself as the points at which its movement impinges on the external world and feels checks and frictions. Physics thus becomes inordinately conspicuous, as when philology submerges the love of letters, for lack of a good disposition that should allow us to take physics for granted. Much in nature is delightful to know and to keep in mind, but much also, the whole infinite remainder, is obscure and uninteresting. And were we practically well adjusted to its issue, we might gladly absolve ourselves from studying its processes. In a world that, in extent and complexity, so far outruns human energies, physical knowledge ought to be largely virtual. That is, nature ought to be represented by a suitable attitude toward it, by the attitude which reason would dictate were knowledge complete, and not by explicit ideas. The ancients were happily inspired when they imagined that beyond the gods and the fixed stars the cosmos came to an end, for the empyrean beyond was nothing in particular, nothing to trouble oneself about. Many existences are either out of relation to man altogether, or have so infinitesimal an influence on his experience that they may be sufficiently represented there by an atom of stardust. And it is probable that if, out of pure curiosity, we wish to consider very remote beings and had the means of doing so, we should find the detail of existence in them wholly incommensurable with anything we can conceive. Such beings could be known virtually only in that we might speak of them in the right key, representing them in appropriate symbols, and might move in their company with the right degree of respectful indifference. The present situation of science, however, reverses the ideal one. Physics, in so far as it exists, is explicit and at variance with our acquired attitude towards things, so that we may justly infer by the shock our little knowledge gives us that our presumptions and assumptions have been so egregious that more knowledge would give us still greater shocks. Meantime, dialectic, or knowledge of ideal things, remains merely virtual. The ideal usually comes before us only in revulsions, which we cannot help feeling against some scandalous situation or some intolerable muddle. We have no time or genius left, after our agitated soundings and bawlings, to think of navigation as a fine art, or to consider freely the sea and sky or the land we are seeking. The proper occupation of the mind is gone, or rather, not initiated. A further bad consequence of this illiberal state is that, among many who have, in spite of the times, adoration in their souls. To adore physics, to worship being, seems a philosophical religion, whereas, of course, it is the essence of idolatry. The true God is an object of intent, an ideal of excellence and knowledge, not a term belonging to sense or to probable hypothesis, or to the prudent management of affairs. After we have squared our accounts with nature and taken sufficient thought for our bodily necessities, the eyes can be lifted for the first time to the eternal, the rest was superstition and the quaking use of a false physics. That appeal to the supernatural, which while the danger threatens is but forlorn medicine, after the blow has fallen, many turn to sublime wisdom. This wisdom has cast out the fear of material evils, and dreads only that the divine should not come down and be worthily entertained among us. In art, in politics, in that form of religion which is superior and not inferior to politics and art, we define and embody intent, and the intent embodied dignifies the work and lends interest to its conditions. So, in science, it is dialectic that makes physics speculative and worthy of a free mind. The baser utilities of material knowledge would leave life itself perfectly vain if they did not help it to take on an ideal shape. Ideal life, insofar as it constitutes science, is dialectical. It consists in seeing how things hang together perspicuously and how the later phases of any process fill out, as in good music, the tendency and promise of what went before. This derivation may be mathematical or it may be moral, but in either case the data and problem define the result, dialectic being insight into their inherent correspondence. Intent is one of many evidences that the intellect's essence is practical. Intent in action in the sphere of thought, it corresponds to transition and derivation in the natural world. Analytic psychology is obliged to ignore intent, for it is obliged to regard it merely as a feeling. But while the feeling of intent is a fact like any other, intent itself is an aspiration, a passage, the recognition of an object, which not only is not a part of the feeling given, but is often incapable of being a feeling or a fact at all. What happened to motion under Eleatic analysis happens to intent under an anatomizing reflection. The parts do not contain the movement of transition which makes them a whole. Moral experience is not expressible in physical categories, because while you may give place and date for every feeling that something is important or is absurd, you cannot so express what these feelings have discovered and wished to confide to you. The importance and the absurdity have disappeared. Yet it is this pronouncement concerning what things are absurd or important that makes the intent of those judgments. To touch it, you have to enter the moral world. That is, you have to bring some sympathetic or hostile judgment to bear on those you are considering, and to meet intent not by noting its existence, but by estimating its value, by collating it with your own intent. If some one says 2 and 2 are 5, you are no counter-mathematician when you conscientiously put it down that he said so. Your science is not relevant to his intent until you run some risk yourself in that arena and say, no, 2 and 2 are 4. Feelings and ideas, when plucked and separately considered, do not retain the intent that made them cognitive or living. Yet in their native medium, something certainly lived and knew. If this ideality or transcendence seems a mystery, it is such only in the sense in which every initial or typical fact is mysterious. Every category would be unthinkable if it were not actually used. The mystery in this instance has, however, all that can best serve to make a mystery homely and amiable. It is supported by a strong analogy to other familiar mysteries. The fact that intellect has intent and does not constitute or contain what it envisages is like the fact that time flows, that bodies gravitate, that experience is gathered, or that existence is suspended between being and not being. Propagation in animals is mysterious and familiar in the same fashion. Cognition, too, is an expedient for vanquishing instability. As reproduction circumvents mortality and preserves a semblance of permanence in the midst of change, so intent regards what is not yet, or not here, or what exists no longer. Thus the pulverization proper to existence is vanquished by thought, which in a moment announces or commemorates other moments, together with the manner of their approach or recession. The mere image of what is absent constitutes no knowledge of it. A dream is not knowledge of a world like it existing elsewhere. It is simply another more fragile world. What renders the image cognitive is the intent that projects it and disputes it to be representative. It is cognitive only in use when it is a vehicle of an assurance which may be right or wrong, because it takes something ulterior for its standard. We may give intent a somewhat more congenial aspect if we remember that thought comes to animals in proportion to their docility in the world and to their practical competence. The more plastic a being is to experience, so long as he retains vital continuity and a cumulative structure, the more intelligent he becomes. Intelligence is an expression of adaptation, an impressionable and prophetic structure. What wonder, then, that intelligence should speak of things that inspire it and that lend it its oracular and practical character, namely, of things at that moment not possessed, but merely posited, in other words, of the surrounding world. Mere feeling might suffice to translate into consciousness each particle of protoplasm in its isolation, but to translate the relations of that particle to what is not itself and to express its response to those environing presences, intent and conscious signification are required. Intellect transcends the given and means the absent, because life, of which intellect is the fulfillment, or entelechy, is itself absorbed from without and radiated outward. As life depends on an equilibrium of material processes, which reach far beyond the individual they sustain in being, so intent is a recognition of our outlying existences which sustain in being that very sympathy by which they are recognized. Intent and life are more than analogous. If we use the word life in an ideal sense, the two are coincident, for, as Aristotle says, the act proper to intellect is life. The flux is so pervasive, so subtle in its persistency, that even those miracles which suspend it must somehow share its destiny. Intent bridges many a chasm, but only by leaping across. The life that is sustained for years, the political or moral purpose that may bind whole races together, is condemned to be partly a memory and partly a plan, and wholly an ideal. Its scope is nothing but the range to which it can continually extend its sympathies and its power of representation. Its moments have nothing in common except their loyalties and a conspiring interest in what is not themselves. This moral energy, so closely analogous to physical interplay, is of course not without a material basis. Spiritual sublimation does not consist in using matter, but in using it up, in making it all useful. When life becomes rational, it continues to be mechanical and to dramatize room and energy in the natural world. In its most intimate and supernatural functions, intellect has natural conditions. In dreams and madness, intent is confused and wayward. In idiocy, it is suspended altogether. Nor has discourse any other pledge that it is addressing kindred interlocutors, except that which it receives from the disposition and habit of bodies. People who have not yet been born into the world have not yet begun to think about it. There is, of course, an inner dialectical relevance among all propositions that have the same ideal theme, no matter how remote or unknown to one another those who utter the propositions may be. But the medium in which this infinite dialectical network is woven is out of time and indifferent to the direction in which thought might traverse it. In other words, it is not discourse or intelligence, but eternal truth. From the point of view of experience, this prior dialectical relation of form to form is merely potential, for the thoughts between which it would obtain need never exist or be enacted. There is society only among incarnate ideas, and it is only by expressing some material situation that an idea is selected out of the infinity of not impossible ideas and promoted to the temporal dignity of actual thought. Moreover, even if the faculty of intelligence were disembodied and could exist in a vacuum, it would still be a vain possession if no data were given for it to operate upon, and if no particular natural structure, animal, social, or artistic, were at hand for intelligence to ally itself to and defend. Reason would in that case die in the nation. It would have no subject matter and no sanction, as well as no seat. Intelligence is not a substance, it is a principle of order and of art. It requires a given situation and some particular natural interest to bring it into play. In fact, it is nothing but a name for the empire which conscious, but at bottom irrational, interests attain over the field in which they operate. It is the fruition of life, the token of successful operation. Every theme or motive in the life of reason expresses some instinct rooted in the body and incidental to natural organization. The intent by which memory refers to past or reported experience, or the intent by which perception becomes recognition, is a transcript of relations in which events actually stand to one another. Such intent represents modifications of structure and action important to life, modifications that have responded to forces on which life is dependent. Both desire and meaning translate into cognitive or ideal energy, into intent, material relations subsisting in nature. These material relations give practical force to the thought that expresses them, and the thought in turn gives significance and value to the forces that subserve it. Fulfillment is natural, in one direction bringing material potentialities to the light and making them actual and conscious, and in the other direction embodying intent in the actual forms of things and manifesting reason. Nothing could be more ill-considered than the desire to disembody reason. Reason cries aloud for reunion with the material world, which she needs not only for a basis, but, what concerns her even more, for a theme. In private and silent discourse, when words and grammar are swathed in reverie, the material basis and reference of thought may be forgotten. Desire and intent may then seem to disport themselves in a purely ideal realm. Moral or logical tensions alone may seem to determine the whole process. Meditative persons are even inclined to regard the disembodied life which they think they enjoy at such times as the true and native form of existence. All organs, applications, and expressions of thought they deprecate and call accidental. As some pious souls reject dogma to reach pure faith and suspend prayer to enjoin union, so some mystical logicians drop the world in order to grasp reality. It is an exquisite suicide, but the energy and ideal that sustain such a flight are annihilated by its issue, and the soul drops like a paper balloon, consumed by the very flame that wafted it. No thought is found without an organ. None is conceivable without a verbal expression which is that organ's emanation, and none would be significant without a subject matter lying in the world of which that organ is a part. Significant language forms a great system of ideal tensions contained in the mutual relations of parts of speech and of clauses and propositions. Of these tensions, the intent in a man's mind at any moment is a living specimen. Experience at that moment may have a significance, a transitive force that asks to be enshrined in some permanent expression. The more acute and recoverable the crisis is, the more urgent the need of transmitting to other moments some cognizance of what was once so great. But were this experience to excel in spirit in a vacuum, using no conventional and transmissible medium of expression, it would be foiled in its intent. It would leave no monument and achieve no immortality in the world of representation. For the experience and its expression would remain identical and perish together, just as the perception and its object would remain identical and perish together if there were no intelligence to discover the material world, to which the perplexing shifts of sensation may be habitually referred. Spontaneous expression, if it is to be recognizable, and therefore in effect expressive, labors under the necessity of subordinating itself to an ideal system of expressions, a permanent language in which its spontaneous utterances may be embedded. By virtue of such adoption into a common medium, expression becomes interpretable. A later moment may then reconstruct the past out of its surviving memorial. Intent, besides the form it has in language, where it makes the soul of grammar, has many other modes of expression. In mathematical and logical reasoning, in action, and those contemplated and suspended acts, which we call estimation, policy, or morals. Moral philosophy, the wisdom of Socrates, is merely a consideration of intent. The intent passed over from existence to ideality, the nexus lying in the propulsive nature of life, which could not have been capped by any form of knowledge, which was not itself in some way transitive and ambitious. Intent, though it looks away from existence and the actual, is the most natural and pervasive of things. Physics and dialectic meet in this, that the second brings to fruition what the first describes, namely existence, and that both have their transcendental root in the flux of being. Matter cannot exist without some form, much as by shedding every form in succession, it may proclaim its aversion to fixity and its radical formlessness or infinitude. Nor can form, without the treacherous aid of matter, pass from its ideal possibility into selected and instant being. In order to live, if such a myth may be allowed, the Titan matter was eager to disguise his incorrigible vagueness and pretend to be something. He accordingly addressed himself to the beautiful company of forms, sisters whom he thought all equally beautiful. Though their number was endless and equally fit to satisfy his heart, he wooed them hypocritically, with no intention of wedding them, yet he uttered their names in such seductive accents, called by mortals intelligence and toil, that the virgin goddesses offered no resistance, at least such of them as happened to be near or of a facile disposition. They were presently deserted by their unworthy lover, yet they, too, in that moment's union, had tasted the sweetness of life. The heaven to which they returned was no longer an infinite mathematical paradise. It was crossed by memories of earth, and a warmer breath lingered in some of its lanes and grottos. Henceforth, its nymphs could not forget that they had awakened a passion, and that, unmoved themselves, they had moved a strange, indomitable giant to art and love.